Welcome back. We're watching a world that's changing before our eyes. The death of George Floyd seemed to be the tipping point, but in reality, the calls for change and equality started long before that. Racial tensions have been simmering since the very beginning of the United States. 13 Action News continues our ongoing dialogue about race. We call it Bridging the Divide.
The study of history is one of competing narratives. I mean, one thing that I think people don't recognize about this country is after slavery ended, this country bought into an idea about slavery that was crafted by the former slaveholders.
The summer of 1619 was etched in American history books as the first recorded arrival of enslaved Africans in what would become the United States. But that journey was only a turning point in 2.5 centuries of slavery in North America. The African slave trade began long before that in European colonies.
Most people suggest that the codification of racism in the United States begins in the late 17th century and is firmly grounded by the beginning of the 1700s.
History tells us that in late August of 1619, Africans were kidnapped from their villages in what is present-day Angola, taken by Portuguese slave traders and forced onto a ship bound for what Europeans called the New World, onto the shores of Jamestown, Virginia. It was there a ship known as the White Lion brought 20 and odd Negroes ashore and then sold them for food.
What makes the bondage unique in the Americas is that it was determined that only people of African descent could be enslaved. So whatever suffering the Irish or the Italians or any other white ethnic group suffered in this country, it was nothing compared to the fact that the only enslavable group of people were determined to be black people.
Inside the slave ships revealed an ugly truth, rigged by inhumane conditions. Captives were stripped naked, beaten and bound by shackles. Experts say from 1501 to 1867, more than 12 million Africans were captured, ripped from their families, sold, and transported to America. Many Africans died on the voyage from malnutrition and disease.
Enslaved people were not only broken physically, but they were broken psychologically.
The conditions of slavery were brutal. Blacks were prohibited to learn, read, and write. They were not considered human beings, but rather property of their masters, and often beaten with whips, sexually assaulted, and mentally abused.
Brave so long, Miss Scarlett. You just gotta go on being brave.
Recently, HBO canceled Gone with the Wind. They took it off HBO Max because it doesn't represent kind of a modern understanding of race and slavery and the Civil War. And one of the reasons that movie was so popular, though, in its heyday, is because that was the narrative that made white people comfortable with the idea that slavery existed within this country. And so one piece I wrote a few years ago was looking at how the memoirs of former slaveholders and the publications that they released all talked about how benign slavery was, how friendly white Southerners were with black Southerners, how much enslaved people supposedly loved the masters.
With cash crops of tobacco, cotton, and sugar, Southern states became a lucrative business in the 17th and 18th century. Black slaves were their fuel.
There was an intentional distinction between what they called privileged slaves or domestic slaves in the house against those who were in the fields. And also complexion came into play as well.
Black stereotypes stem from the days of slavery and continue to play a significant role in shaping attitudes towards black men and women today.
There was this association in the 18th century between apes and black people that even the founding father of the country, Thomas Jefferson, a slave owner himself and an abuser of enslaved people, wrote in his notes as an authoritative source. So these are very deep roots that the top officials within the U.S. government bought into.
What the white man has done to you and me, he has divided us.
What we're finding in the perceived threats of black men is that this starts very early. I mean, if you read the journals of slave traders from Europe who went into Western Africa, the way they describe black men, they go into great detail about their bodies and this perceived sexual prowess of black men, which also is attached to that animalization component that we spoke of earlier. This idea that they were unrestrained in their appetites.
By the 1830s to the 1860s, the shackles on black lives started to rust. The movement to abolish slavery in America was heard. It was on June 19, 1865, that Union soldiers landed in Texas with word that the war had ended and slaves were now free. 2.5 years after President Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, and as slavery and the Civil War ended, a promise was made by the U.S. government. The phrase, 40 acres and a mule, was meant to redistribute land to blacks who had suffered economically, mentally, and physically through slavery.
The thing about the 40 acres and a mule is one thing that's misunderstood is that some people did get it and then it was taken away. So it was one of those, another series of false promises that the U.S. government has proposed, given a little bit, but then just taken it away. And they've always done this under the complaints of white society.
Action News will continue our ongoing dialogue about race. In part 2 of Understanding the Oppressed and Racism, we'll take a look at how Jim Crow laws shaped America. Good morning, Las Vegas. Still